Today we're talking about Latin American history, and we're going to take a look at Chapter 6 of Martin and Wasserman's book. Chapter 6 is A New People and Their World. I'm Joseph Holbrook, your professor for Latin American history. So the making of multi-ethnic societies. Latin American society was extremely diverse, ethnically, as well as in a number of other ways. Within 9 months of the arrival of the Spaniards and the Portuguese, Mestizos, baby Mestizos, and Mamelucos began to arrive. Mestizos, the name for the mixture of Spanish and indigenous people in the Spanish territories. In the Brazilian territories, it was, or the Portuguese territories, it was the Mamelucos. The very first ships arriving with Christopher Columbus also included African slaves, as well as some freeborn Africans. New Christians came as well. These were formerly Jewish populations of Spain that had converted to Catholicism under duress. They were almost always suspect by the Spanish authorities because they were suspected of continuing to practice their Judaism secretly. Also, there were non-Iberians, non-Iberian Europeans that were present in the New World. There were Germans, specifically in Venezuela, and in some countries such as Chile, you had Irish Catholics such as Ambrosio O'Higgins, the father of Bernardo O'Higgins, who was one of the heroes of the Wars of Independence. In addition to blood, race, or ethnicity, there were also two other determinants of social position: wealth and honor. Wealthy Indian nobility sometimes ranked higher in the system than Mestizos or even some Creoles who were poor. Many Mestizos became wealthy as merchants or landowners. Honor was another driving force in the value system of the emerging Latin America. It was an honor-based culture, as you may have seen if you've watched the film Camila, about Camilo O'Gorman in Argentina in 1847. The ratio of men to women among Portuguese immigrants to Brazil was very low. Many Spanish and Portuguese immigrants were young bachelors eager for their fortunes in the Indies. Peninsulares usually referred to people who were actually born in Iberia, and they considered themselves superior to the Creoles, who were white Europeans, but they were born in the Americas. Everyone had a clearly defined place in the social hierarchy of Latin America, with the white Iberians at the top and African slaves at the bottom. Creoles were whites born in the Americas. They usually received lower positions in the administrative, government, or religious hierarchies. Mestizos and mulattoes were the results of mixed-race marriages or rapes or liaisons, mestizos being a combination of European and Native American, and mulattoes being the combination of white European and African. Native Americans were sometimes nobility, so there was some ranking and hierarchy even within the Native Americans, and then the African slaves were at the bottom. The Creoles most often occupied lower positions in the civil and ecclesiastical bureaucracies. Many were artisans, petty merchants, small landowners. Some became quite wealthy as merchants, ranchers, or miners. Some obtained high offices as judges, and occasionally there were even viceroys that were born in the Americas. However, they were the exception rather than the norm. They often occupied the lower levels of civil and church bureaucracies. Many others were artisans, petty merchants, or small landowners. Peninsular immigrants scoffed at their pretensions to be pure, to demonstrate pure European descent. Many people successfully hid their Indian and African ancestry and passed as completely white. The offspring of European men and Native American women were called Mestizos or Mamelucos in Brazil. The first generation were mostly illegitimate, giving them from the very beginning a social stigma. The Mamelucos along the coast of Brazil were much less numerous because there was not a high concentration of Tupi Indians along the coast of Brazil comparable to the Aztec Empire or the Incan Empire. And many of the Tupi Indians died off rather quickly with the various European diseases. By the 17th and 18th centuries, large numbers of mestizos lived in Spanish cities. They were normally excluded from artisans' guilds, and there was a good deal of prejudice against the mestizos, although they were considered to be gente de razón, which made them exempt from Indian tribute. The phrase gente de razón is a rather prejudiced or racist phrase that meant people of reason, or people who were civilized. Africans were especially common in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the coastal areas of Central and South America. The Indian population in Mexico rebounded after 1630, so African slavery gradually disappeared in Mexico. The same might be said of several other countries, such as Argentina, that actually pursued a deliberate government strategy of whitening by encouraging European immigration. Africans were usually baptized as Catholics. As such, they were subject to prosecution by the Inquisition. Recent arrivals normally performed heavy, unskilled labor, and American-born slaves were often skilled in various trades. Slave families were permitted to marry, occasionally even to marry with other freed blacks. Many Africans managed to retain elements of their culture and religion, another example of syncretism. The same was true, of course, among Native Americans, who retained much of their culture and their religion just by renaming it with Catholic terms. Africans often did the same thing. Their culture included dance, music, religious beliefs, practices, sometimes disguised with Catholic symbols. As Catholics, the slaves were subject to the Inquisition and suspicion of heretical practices. African women played a particularly important role in passing along the residual African culture and religious beliefs to their children. There were slave rebellions, often in colonial Latin America. In 1735 in Cordoba, Mexico, 2,000 slaves from a sugar and tobacco plantations rose up against their owners. They killed the plantation overseers and destroyed crops and carried off equipment for 5 months. 6 years later, there was another uprising in the same area. Other slaves found freedom by escaping to remote areas far from European influence. Even as early as 1503, African slaves were escaping from the control of the Europeans to join Indian villages and join them in resisting against the white Europeans. The slaves often used what's known as the weapons of the weak. These are subtle actions of resistance or protest, such as feigning illness or sabotaging work routines. In theory, the slaves could appeal to the courts if they were mistreated. In some extreme cases, women performed abortions for infanticide in order to save their infants from slavery. African spiritual practices or witchcraft often were resorted to as tools of resistance against Europeans. An African who was capable of divination and casting of spells and skilled in that, or had a reputation for that, could often make some cash on the side through this practice that would allow them to purchase their freedom. There was also communities of runaways known as maroon communities in English. They were known as cimarrones in Spanish. Their communities of refuge were called palenques. In Brazil, they were known the same thing was called a quilombo or palenque. They supported themselves through subsistence agriculture, bartering produce, and raiding nearby haciendas and towns. In Venezuela, the population of these maroon communities reached 20,000 people, runaway slaves. Also in eastern Cuba, palenques proliferated along the Sierra Maestra in El Oriente. These were many of the same people living in El Oriente that came to the aid of Fidel Castro when he first arrived in the Sierra Maestra to begin his rebellion against Colonel Batista. In 1670, there was a famous quilombo called Palmares in Brazil that got as large as 30,000 inhabitants and even had its own king. It lasted for 60 or 70 years before it was destroyed by the Brazilian government. In terms of class and ethnicity, these were huge factors in the success or failure of people who were trying to move up the social ladder. The benefits of financial success were modest but still significant. Wealth and ethnicity played a role in patron-client relationships. A patron was somebody of a higher social standing who could provide help with someone lower on the social ladder. El patron. The lighter-skinned people had more chances to marry up than dark-skinned people. By the middle of the 18th century, there was a bewildering range of possible racial categories. Ethnic identities were fluid and highly subjective. The same person might be listed in one document as an Español, or in another document as a Mestizo, and in a third document they might be listed as a mulatto. It all depended on in which situation or context, which identity was to their advantage. Mestizos living in Indian villages sometimes found it to their advantage to pass as indios, because the indios had certain protections under the República de los Indios and the new laws. Ethnicity was very fluid over a lifetime. Those of you that live in Miami can understand this, because if you come from Colombia, you might think of yourself as a Paisa or a Bogotano. Then in Miami, you begin to think of yourself as Latino, because you've got friends from Nicaragua, Cuba, Puerto Rico. Then you go to someplace like Iowa, and people may view you as a Mexican, or you may see yourself as Hispanic. And so identity for people living in Miami is a very fluid thing, and it was the same thing in early Latin America. There was also a very important factor of gender and patriarchy. It was an honor-based society, so the personal reputation was everything. To lose honor could cause you to lose your social standing and even lose financial advantages. Your reputation depended on how much you adhered to a comprehensive code of honor. The code of honor prescribed rules of proper behavior for males and females at all stages of life, and it included such things as marriage, sexuality, and honesty in business. In the family, it was a patriarchal system. Central to the notion of honor was that all women needed to be under the control of men, the hands of their fathers or their sons if they become a widow. This comes from Roman culture and the idea of pater familias. The king was seen as the ultimate paternal figure for society. The church and state paid attention to marriage. Families of means were provided daughters with a dowry. Once the ceremony was performed, the union was for life. There was no such thing as there was divorce, but it just meant a separation. It did not allow people to remarry. In rare cases where there's some proof, an annulment might be possible. Also, with sexuality, the church forbade all sexual activity outside of marriage not intended for procreation. Women who bore children out of wedlock suffered great dishonor. Abortion and infanticide were not unknown. The priesthood was closed to those who were born illegitimate. And men's sexual activities were far more difficult to monitor, obviously, than women's. Homosexuality was also punished, sometimes by execution, depending on the social status of the person. In 1659, 120 homosexual men were rounded up, and 14 were executed. Another example is given in the book of Dr. Gaspar Gonzalez, who had a high social status. He was a homosexual priest. He was punished, but his lover was executed because he was of a lower social class. Many people found the rules impractical or irrelevant. Women had to go out and earn a living. Working women had a harder time defending their honor and reputation than the higher class women. Some women turned to prostitution and tripled their earnings. There were many households composed of single or abandoned women. Convents formed a respectable alternative to living in a male-dominated household, and sometimes women who wanted to pursue intellectual pursuits would join a convent, such as the case was of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in Mexico. There was also a very strong code of social etiquette. People had to use terms such as don and doña for those who were above them. You could use usted to express a respect. The tu form was never used with someone who was your superior. and the administration of justice was public. Thank you for